Hello, class. For this lecture will be about it says clash of cultures there on the title card, but really is in the sense the conquest of the Americas by the Europeans. But in order to see to get the background of how that came to be, we need to go back a little further. It's called the Age of Exploration by historians, but really it's the Age of Conquest. It's European powers going to other places that are occupied by other people and basically taking them over, usually through the use, almost exclusively through the use of force. And one thing that we need to go further back on, historical events always have short-term and long-term causes. So when we look at long-term causes of why Christopher Columbus took those ships out in the ocean, we kind of have to go way further back to what is known as the Silk Road. And this was basically the exchange of goods coming from Asia into Europe, and some going back the other way, but mostly those coming from Asia into Europe. At the center of this East-West exchange was a city known as Constantinople. Now, there were many reasons that people had generated a desire for, goods from the Orient. And, you can trace it also back to the Crusades when Europeans first started to make their way in the Middle East and get exposed to these things. So you already get this, earnest desire for these goods to be coming back and forth. Another guy who plays a major role in this, this lust for more Asian goods and to learn more about Asia is a man named Marco Polo. Marco Polo plays an interesting role in the fact that he's a Venetian merchant. At that time, Italy wasn't a country; it was a group of city-states ruled by the wealthy elite families of that city-state. Marco Polo belongs to one of those families, and he finds his way into China, looking for more trade routes. And he ends up being captured and held in the court of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. And while he's held by him, Genghis Khan knows that these are the people that are at the outskirts of his empire. So these are the people he's trading with or could, in time, possibly, invade and conquer. So he keeps Marco Polo around to really learn from him, learn, who these people are. In time, he kind of makes his way into the court of Kublai Khan, eventually becomes an emissary, travels all over China, and eventually he does make his way back into Italy. And by the time he gets to Italy, his family's fallen out of favor, and he's easily arrested. And by, happy coincidence, his cellmate's an author, and he starts telling him all these stories about his travels in China and, his different adventures. So they set it down in what would become the book, The Travels of Marco Polo, or The Adventures of Marco Polo. Now, mind you, everything I've said, you got to take with a grain of salt, because a lot of what I've just told you, comes from Marco Polo, and, there's not much other evidence to corroborate it. But the effect the book has is very real, because a lot of people read it. It's the second most popular book, next to the Bible at the time. And, it just generates more of an interest in going to Asia, getting Asian goods. In fact, Christopher Columbus had a copy of his book in his cabin when he sailed out into the ocean. Now, another event that we can't minimize is, earlier I said Constantinople was a center of East-West trade. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople and renamed it, and that's a city named to this day, is Istanbul. And what they end up doing, so now they control the gateway to the east, and they end up adding taxes to a lot of goods, making the prices of all these goods go up. And so now people don't want to pay those high prices, so they're trying to find a way around them. Incidentally, this is one of the longest standing empires in Europe. In fact, they're called the Ottoman Turks. It's really the Ottoman Empire. And this empire will exist all the way to World War I, where it sides on the wrong side of that war, and it finally collapses. Now, these are the reasons that, they got a taste for Asian goods, Asian spices. They get an idea that there's precious metals to be found there. There's some religious zealots that we can conquer more people. But in the end, let's be honest, it's, the God, gold, and glory, it is gold. The Portuguese began their explorations, and not knowing anything about the Americas yet, they decide to try to find a way to sail around Constantinople, around Africa. And Prince Henry the Navigator and others mark the way slowly around, hugging the coast, and eventually they make it past the Cape of Good Hope. And once you get past there, like, that's where real treacherous waters. That's why it says that. And eventually they made their way into India and land in India. And Vasco da Gama is the first one to lead a full-scale, I guess what you would call like, an economic enterprise into India. He follows the path, lands in India, buys all these Asian spices, and he brings them back to Europe, and he sells them for 1,000% profit. That's how rare these things are, and that's how high a demand these things were. This guy made tons of money on this trip, so you got to better believe he's coming back, along with others. So the Portuguese send their fleet because India is still controlled, by the outskirts of the Ottoman Empire. So they send a fleet and some soldiers and defeat the Ottoman holding there in India, therefore getting a foothold in India, which gets them into the east. Now, unfortunately, they're now like the Portuguese are now the ones who now control that path to Asia. So this is all exclusively Portuguese, a Portuguese route. So now other people are looking for another way to get to Asia. Enter Christopher Columbus. Now, before Christopher Columbus comes into the picture, Spain has to become a country. Spain really wasn't a country before he emerges into the picture, because Spain was an Islamic caliphate. It was actually known as Al-Andalus. It had been occupied by the Moors, which is now Islamic caliphate, for 500 years, and the Reconquista, different houses, clans in Spain, defeat and finally fight the Moors and defeat them and get them out of Spain. And the two main houses, Castile and Aragon, are united in the marriage of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand, creating the country of Spain. Now, that Spanish country is brand new. It is weak. It is poor. And, they know that if they don't do something about all those things, other European powers could swallow them up. And so they were worried, and they needed to find a way to get some revenue going to do, so they can build up their army, enforce their borders, and just become, a nation on its own 2 feet who can stand up for itself, against the European powers who are always expanding and looking for new territory. In walks Christopher Columbus with a crazy idea. Now, I'm not sure if they still give that poem, whatever, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And when this is this old poem that, a lot of history is pop culture. You say it, nothing actually, gets into the history books. But, let me dispel the myth that, he thought the world was flat, and that's why that the sailors thought the world was flat. That's why no one sailed out that way. They thought they're going to fall off the edge of the earth. This is not, this is nothing further from the truth. We've known the earth was round since 2000 BC. The Greeks figured it out. They were already selling globes around this time. Why Columbus was laughed at and called an idiot is because he was bad at math. His idea was that the globe, the world, was much smaller than it was. And all these other ship captains who were better at math than Columbus said, that the earth is X size, and there is no way you can, with the ships we have today, you can put enough food and water in a ship, one of our ships, and sail it all the way to China, because that's, they don't know the Americas are there, but they know the distance from there to China. And there's no way you can do that. That's why they're making fun of Columbus. Columbus said, no, it's much smaller. You guys are wrong. And they just laughed at him. Spain, though, is, they want to take a risk. They got to take a gamble because they're desperate. So they listened to Christopher Columbus and they fund this expedition. And, and honestly, the other captains were right. If they hadn't found Hispaniola and the islands outside of the Americas, we wouldn't have heard from them. The men were already running out of food. They were mutinying already when finally they found land. So if they hadn't found any land, we'd never heard about them. They'd have died at sea, which is exactly what the other captains were saying. In a sense, he was lucky that there was land, but lucky for him and his men, unlucky for the people living on that land. And this is the real Columbus, committed genocide. There's no other way of saying it. He literally wiped out a whole people. And it's a sad story. And a lot of this, Columbus wrote in his own words how he looked at them and said how they could be easily enslaved and conquered. He saw a little bit of gold on some of them and thought there was gold on the island. And he forced them to keep digging gold. And if they didn't bring him gold, he would cut off arms. And when there was resistance, literally they were doing all the horrible things you can think of, smashing babies against rocks, roasting people alive. And, in the end, he pretty much wiped out a whole people in his lust for gold. And never once did he set foot in that continental America. And always he thought he was in India, so that's why we call Indians Indians. This guy was guilty of horrible, horrible crimes. And I guess now you can understand why people have been pushing for Indigenous Day and not Columbus Day on October 12th. Now, the Americas have been discovered. The cat's out of the bag. And now Portugal, who already holds on to one route to Asia, wants a piece of this as well. They argue for the Pope, and then they sign the Treaty of Tordesillas. I always remember Treaty of Tortillas. And there you can see the little red line. To the right on that line, that's Portuguese territory. To the left, that's Spanish territory. And which is why in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, not Spanish. Now, the empire that, the Spanish government via Cortés, encounters in the New World when they land at Veracruz is the Aztec or the Mexica. They speak Nahuatl. By then, the Mayans are all gone. And then there's this crazy story of Quetzalcoatl, and they thought he was a god. We'll get into that in a bit, but no, that's not actually true. Tenochtitlan, the capital city, this is where, they make their way in to conquer the empire. When they arrive, the person in charge at that time is Montezuma II. He rises in power in 1502. Now, in order to explore, conquer, I think the better word is conquer the new world that they have just gained. Spain at that time, even though Columbus landed, he didn't find no gold. He brought slaves, and that was about it. The Spanish government still didn't have the money for any large-scale expeditions. So they turned to conquistadores. Conquistadores were soldiers who had, war battlefield experience in the Reconquista. They also had money. They could fund their own people, their own expedition, so that they would make a, deal with the crown. Now, anytime you wanted to go, let's say, you're going to land in the Yucatan. You would mark out where you're going to the Spanish crown. You would ask for their permission. They would grant you the permission. All they ask for you in return is 8% of whatever you take out, el octo. And what this did for the Spanish government is it allowed them to make a profit without even investing any money. So this is a highly profitable setup for the Spanish government. And if the guys fail, well, there's no sweat off their back. And so they turned to conquistadores to do this. So, different conquistadores, would set out to different places and get the permission of the crown. Now, Cortés is different. Cortés had been to Mexico one time before on a previous expedition, knew there was riches there, and so he organized his own expedition. And as he's mounting his men and packing everything up, and he gets ready to sail from what is Cuba, he sails off, and people start to realize he never asked permission from the crown to do so. So this becomes an issue. And so he sails, lands in what we know as Veracruz with some men, and decides to make his way, into what is now Mexico. He, in his early on in his journey, he is handed over a slave who's known by many names. In fact, you're going to have an assignment about this in this week's folder, which is like writing a speech as her. Now, she goes by many names, La Malinche, Malitzin, Doña Marina. She spoke many different languages, so she was Cortés's translator. She allowed him to move through the land and negotiate with other tribes who were subjugated by the Aztec Empire and asked them to join the Spaniards in overthrowing the Aztecs. And in a sense, they thought they were doing a good thing because they're trying to get rid of their oppressors. Little did they know they were removing one oppressor for another. And this is why, to this day, She's seen in many different lights in Mexico, so this is kind of something you're going to explore in your essay, whether, she's a traitor to all of Mexico, or, or was she just, trying to survive. She actually is, in a sense, even though there were more before him, but labeled as the mother of Mexico. She has an affair with Cortez, and they have a child, which is a mestizo, so the first like Mexican mixture of native and European blood. And as we move forward, as Mexican identity and stuff, usually you're going to throw African blood in there as well. But at that time period, they have the baby, and then history looks at her as the mother of Mexico. But also, there's all these derogatory ways of looking at her, which is like La Malinche is not a nice way, of describing somebody. So Cortez makes his way towards Tenochtitlan, trying to unite these native allies behind him, because he can't take out, a whole empire, with just like a few hundred men. Although when I was in school, that's what they made it sound like. Oh, these superior weapons and firepower, these guys, no. That's not what happened. He was smart enough to try to get, people to back him up, native allies. So one of the groups he approaches is Tlaxcalans, and some were receptive, others weren't. So those that weren't were quickly attacked and decimated in the massacre of Cholula, in a sense telling them, join me or die. Now here's I know some of you may have heard this story before, but the background of the story is that they thought Cortez was the return of this god, and they thought he was godlike and all these things, and that's why they let him into the city. None of that's true. We're now realizing that very story or myth or whatever, we don't discover it anywhere until after the Spaniards are there. So we think they kind of interjected themselves into Aztec history. The reality of the situation is this: Montezuma thinks he's a living god. He has all this wealth and power, so he's not scared of these guys. In fact, they don't really look up to these guys as like, oh, look at these tall men or whatever. To begin with, they looked at them as though they were filthy. These guys never bathed. They were just covered in hair and smelly. You could literally smell them a mile away. They really looked down on these barbaric savages, which is really interesting because that's how the Spaniards are looking at them. But anyway, so Montezuma contemplated what to do about these new groups of people arriving on his shores. He eventually decides that because he's the all-great, powerful, wealthy emperor, that he will impress them. So he finally allows them into the capital. And it's at that point when they're there visiting with Montezuma that they realize there's not a lot of guards around, and they jump and take Montezuma happy. Now, while this is going on, there's an expedition that lands in Veracruz as well, who has come to arrest Cortez for not getting permission for landing, led by Panfilo Narvaez. Cortez hears about this, leaves one of his men in charge, Pedro de Alvarado, and takes some gold and marches toward to meet this, this group of men who are there to arrest him. While he's gone, havoc breaks out in the city. The people are like, who are these strange men barking orders? Where's Montezuma? And there's like little riots breaking out here and there, and it gets worse and worse. So finally, they take Montezuma and they put him on a balcony in front of all these people, and they tell him, Montezuma, calm your people down. And there's two sides to what happens next. The Spaniards say that the Aztecs are angry at Montezuma. They threw rocks, they hit him, and he fell off the balcony and he died. The Aztecs say that the Spaniards got frustrated and stabbed Montezuma, then threw him over. And either way, he's dead, and the people go crazy. He's replaced by Cuauhtemoc, and they just start storming the city, trying to attack the Spaniards and get them out of there. And in what is known as La Noche Triste, the Spaniards, have to flee. But they don't flee empty-handed. They take as much gold as they can stuff in different places, inside their armor, in their pockets and bags. And what this does is it makes them move really slow. And so they're trying to make their way on these causeways to get out of the city, and they're just like slow-moving targets to the Aztecs who throw rocks, arrows, knock them off the causeway, and they fall into the water where normally they could probably swim away, but they're weighted down by all their greed, and they drown. Those that finally make it out end up on the shores and end up linking up eventually with Cortez, who has now convinced the army. He's like, you want to arrest me or you want to get more gold? Well, let's get some more gold. And so he arrives and organizes the final taking of Tenochtitlan. And mind you, they had already won and they didn't even know it because they had left behind disease. And they had decimated the population within the city. Everyone was sick. No one could fight back. And there was not much of a resistance. When they finally lay siege and invade and take it, there's not much left to take. And that is how, Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire, in a sense, Mexico, falls into the hands of the Spanish. In Peru, which is the next big empire to fall, you have an emperor who's, like I mentioned, godlike king who's in charge. He has over 50,000 loyal soldiers and men who support him. Now, one interesting practice, not a lot of people know that the Incas actually mummified people. And so when Capek, their emperor, dies, he's mummified and he's housed in the shaker chamber with all the other mummies. What is very interesting about this practice is they were still able to, the mummies still own their land. They still own their possessions. And so as more and more Incan nobility dies, there's less and less land and stuff to be had by everybody else. So slowly, like a lot of the Incan land in Peru is held by dead people. Huascar has succeeded him as emperor, and he promises, to start burying the mummies and selling off the property so the living could have actual access to the land. His rival in this is his brother, Atahualpa. And he had tried, to get his brother to share power. He refuses. And he doesn't like the new mummy proposal. There's other people that are real strict religious people that don't like the proposal either. So this leads up to a civil war between Atahualpa and his brother Huascar. Atahualpa eventually defeats his brother. And during this time period, the disease has spread because there's, these Mesoamerican, Native American tribes have huge trade networks. So the disease that the Spanish bring gets spread quickly throughout the Americas even before they see a white person. So by the time Pizarro marches toward the Incan Empire, not only has it been devastated by war, it's devastated by disease, so it's a very weakened empire. He also knows, he uses Cortez as his playbook by uniting all the tribes that the Incas had subjugated over to his side to overthrow Atahualpa, which he eventually does. Atahualpa does the exact same thing that Montezuma does, trying to impress these Spaniards with their wealth and power. And these guys, march in to talk to him, and they hand him a Bible, and he doesn't know what it is, so he just kind of drops it, and that's like to them a signal to attack. And by this point, as they're talking, they've been talking with Atahualpa. Their forces have been surrounding the city. So once the shooting starts, per se, they all come storming in, overwhelm Atahualpa and his men, and that is how South America falls to Spain. And then, the Spaniards slowly gain control. Now there's fighting. There's no denying that there was resistance for hundreds of years. Natives resisted against Spanish power, but they were also contesting with disease. And we now know that over 90% of Native Americans in the Americas died from disease. And so their population fell. So, as they tried to mount resistance, they were also not resistant and could not fight back from smallpox and all these other diseases. Because for them, it wasn't just getting one disease, it was getting exposed to all of them, being sick with everything. No one could take care of each other, and whole populations die. Those that live are, sent to work for the Spaniards. And whenever there was land given to, a Spanish nobleman, here's 1,000 acres, whatever natives were living in those acres were kind of commended to them, in a sense, what they would say for their protection and to convert them to Christianity, but really they were used for slavery. This is called the encomienda system. And this is how they convert them to slave labor. But they quickly learn that a lot of them die off or take off, and they end up, in order to sustain the labor force they want, they start bringing Africans into Latin America. They also start to, sneakily change over some local customs, some local religions into Spanish and Catholic, practices. Like the most famous one is the Virgin Mary. That she's a big symbol in Latin America. The reason is she is the exact like kind of a copy of a god they were already worshiping, known as Tonantzin. If you see some pictures of Tonantzin, they're pretty much images of the Virgin Mary. They just kind of co-opted her and tried to take their cultural practice and absorb it into theirs. They start creating up all kinds of class codes and racial hierarchy as far as mixture of the bloods, and then they start to enforce their European gender, hierarchy where, women really had no rights because, like I mentioned earlier, even in another lecture, even the Aztecs and the Incas and all, women actually could own property and they had rights. They could be priests. They start to remake the societies there in their own, like European societies. And then, looking down on any non-Europeans that are living there and somehow co-opting their culture to get them to absorb and obey and become good Spanish citizens. Of course, not with all the privileges.